Voice and Phenomenon by Jacques Derrida, translated from the French by Leonard Lawlor, read by Jacob Flanagan. Chapter 5, The Sign and the Blink of an Eye. The sharp point of the instant, the identity of lived experience present to itself in the same instant, bears therefore the whole weight of this demonstration. Self-presence must be produced in the undivided unity of a temporal present in order to have nothing to make known to itself by the proxy of the sign. Such a perception or intuition of the self by the self in presence would be not only the instance in which signification in general would not be able to have a place, it would also secure the possibility of an originary perception or intuition in general, that is, non-signification, as the principle of all principles. And later, each time that Husserl would like to indicate the sense of originary intuition, he will recall that originary intuition is the experience of the absence and uselessness of the sign. The demonstration that concerns us occurs at a point in time earlier than the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, and for systematic as well as historical reasons, the temporality of lived experience is not a theme of the logical investigations. However, given the point where we are in the logical investigations, we cannot avoid noting that a certain concept of the now, of the present as the punctuality of the instant, authorizes discreetly but in a decisive way the entire system of essential distinctions. If the punctuality of the instant is a myth, a spatial or mechanical metaphor, a metaphysical concept inherited, or all of that at once, if the presence of the presence to self is not simple, if it is constituted in an originary or irreducible synthesis, then the principle of Husserl's entire argumentation is threatened. Here we cannot examine closely the admirable analyses found in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, analyses about which Heidegger says in Sein und Zeit that they are the first in the history of philosophy to break with the concept of time inherited from Aristotle's physics, and determined on the basis of the notions of now, of point, of limit, and of circle. Let us, however, try to take from Husserl's analyses some points of reference for the viewpoint that we are occupying. 1. The concept of punctuality of the now, the stigmi, regardless of whether or not it is a metaphysical presupposition, still plays a role there that is major. Undoubtedly, no now can be isolated as an instant and pure punctuality. Not only does Husserl recognize it, it belongs to the essence of lived experiences that they must be spread out in this way, that lived experience can never have in it an isolated punctual phase, but his entire description is adapted with an incomparable suppleness and perceptiveness to the original modifications of this irreducible spreading out. Nevertheless, this spreading out is still thought and described on the basis of the self-identity of the now as a point, as source point. The idea of originary presence and in general of beginning, the absolute beginning, the principium, always refers in phenomenology to this source point. Although the flowing of time is not indivisible to fragments that could be by themselves and indivisible into phases that could be by themselves into points of continuity, the modes of the flowing of an immanent temporal object have a beginning, so to speak, source point. This is the mode of flowing by which the immanent object begins to be. It is characterized as present. Despite all the complexity of its structure, temporality has a non-displaceable center, an I or a living nucleus that is punctuality of the actual now. The, quote, apprehension of the now is, as it were, the nucleus of the comet's tail of retentions, unquote. And, quote, there is each time but a present punctual phase that is now, while the others link themselves to it as a retentional trail, unquote. And quote again, actually present now is necessary, something punctual, and remains something punctual, ein punctuels. It is a form that persists while the matter is always new, unquote. It is to this self-identity of the actual current now that Husserl is referring with the im selben Augenblick with which we started. Moreover, there is no possible objection within philosophy in regard to this privilege of the present now. This privilege defines the very element of philosophical thought. It is evidentness itself, conscious thought itself. It governs every possible concept of truth and of sense. We cannot raise suspicions about it without beginning to enucleate consciousness from itself, from an elsewhere of philosophy, which takes away from discourse all possible security and every possible foundation. And it is really around the privilege of the actual present, of the now, that in the last analysis, this debate, which resembles no other, is played out between philosophy, which is always a philosophy of presence, and a thought of non-presence, which is not inevitably its opposite, nor necessarily a mediation on negative absence, or even a theory of non-presence as unconscious. The domination of the now is not only systematic with the founding opposition of metaphysics, namely that of form, or eidos, or idea, and matter as the opposition of actuality and potentiality. Quote, the actually present now is necessarily and remains something punctual. It is a form that persists, der Harende, while the matter is always new. Unquote. It secures the tradition that continues the Greek metaphysics of presence into the modern metaphysics of presence as self-consciousness. The metaphysics of the idea as representation, Vorstellung, therefore prescribes the place of a problematic that puts phenomenology into confrontation with every thought of non-consciousness that would know how to approach the genuine stakes and profound agency where the decision is made, the concept of time. It is not by chance that the phenomenology of internal time consciousness confirms the domination of the presence and rejects at once, after the fact, way that an unconscious content becomes conscious, that is, the structure of temporality implied by all of Freud's texts. In fact, Husserl writes, quote, it is a genuine absurdity to speak of an unconscious content that becomes conscious after the fact. Nachtraglich. Consciousness, Bewusstsein, is necessarily being consciousness, Bewusstsein, in each of its phases. Just as the retentional phase is conscious of the preceding phase without making it an object, what is originarily given is already conscious, and under the specific form of the now, without being objective, the retention of an unconscious content is impossible. If each content is in itself and necessarily originarily conscious, it would be absurd to question one about a consciousness that would be given to it later. 2. Despite the motive for the punctual now as the archai form, the form, ideas 1, of consciousness, the content of the description in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness and elsewhere forbids us from speaking of a simple self-identity of the present. We thereby find shaken not only what we could call metaphysical security par excellence, but also, more locally, the argument of the im selben Augenblick found in the logical investigations. All of the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, in its critical work as well as in its descriptive work, demonstrates and confirms the course of the irreducibility of representation, Vergegenwärtigung, Repräsentation, to presentational perception, Vergegenwärtigung, Präsentation. The irreducibility of secondary and reproductive memory to retention of imagination to originary impression, and of the reproduced now to the actual current now, whether it is perceived or retained, etc., without being able to follow here the rigorous way in which the phenomenology of internal time consciousness proceeds, and without it being necessary thereby to question the demonstrative validity of its treatment, we can still question its evidentiary soil and the milieu of these distinctions, question them about what relates the terms distinguished to one another and constitutes the very possibility of the comparison. We see very quickly, then, that the presence of the perceived present is able to appear as such only insofar as it is in continuous composition with a non-presence and a non-perception, namely primary memory and primary anticipation, retention and protension. These non-perceptions are not added on and do not accompany contingently the actually perceived now, indispensably and essentially. They participate in its possibility. No doubt Husserl says that retention is still a perception, but it is the absolutely unique case, Husserl has never spoken of another, of a perception whose perceived is not a present but a past as the modification of the present. Quote, if we call perception the act in which every origin resides, the act that constitutes originarily, then primary memory is perception, for it is only in primary memory that we see the past. It is only in that the past is constituted, and this happens not in a representational way, but on the contrary in a presentational way. Unquote. Thus, in retention, the presentation that gives us something to see delivers a non-present, a past and inactual present. We can therefore suspect that if Husserl nevertheless calls this perception, it is because he is holding on to the radical discontinuity as passing between retention and reproduction, between perception and imagination, etc., and not between perception and retention. This is the, in Latin, nervus demonstrandi of his criticism of Brentano. Husserl absolutely holds on to there being absolutely no question of a continuous mediation of perception with its opposite. Yet, in the preceding section, was not the question of a continuous mediation posed in a really explicit way? Husserl says, quote, "If we now relate the term perception with the differences in the way of being given which temporal objects have, the opposite of perception is then primary memory and primary anticipation, retention and protension, which here comes on the scene, so that perception and non-perception pass continuously into one another." Unquote. And later he writes, quote, "In the ideal sense, perception, impression, would then be at the phase of consciousness that constitutes the pure now in memory, an entirely different phase of the continuity. But here we are only dealing precisely with an ideal limit, something abstract which can be nothing by itself. Nevertheless, this ideal now is not something different toto kaleo from the non-now, but on the contrary, it is in continuous commerce with it, and the continuous passage of perception into primary memory corresponds to that." Unquote. As soon as we admit this continuity of the now and the non-now, of perception and non-perception in the zone of originarity, that is, common to originary impression and to retention, we welcome the other into the self-identity of the Augenblick, non-presence and non-evidentness into the blink of an eye of the instant. There is a duration to the blink of an eye, and the duration closes the eye. This alterity is even the condition of presence, of presentation, and therefore of Vorstellung in general. Prior to all the dissociations which could be produced here, the difference between retention and reproduction, between primary memory and secondary memory, is not the difference, not the radical difference that Husserl would want, between perception and non-perception, but between two modifications of non-perception. Whatever the phenomenological difference might be between these two modifications, despite the immense problems that the difference poses and the necessity of taking them into account, it separates only two ways of being related to the irreducible non-presence of another now. This relation to non-presence, once more, does not take by surprise, surround, or even dissimulate the presence of the originary impression. It allows its upsurge and its ever-reborn virginity. It radically destroys every possibility of self-identity in its simplicity, and that holds for the constituting flow at its greatest depth. Quote, "If we compare now the constituting phenomena to these constituted unities, we find a flow, and at each phase of this flow is a continuity of shading. But in principle, it is impossible to display any phases of this flow in a continuous succession, and therefore to transform in the thought the flow to such an extent that this phase is extended into identity with itself." Unquote. This intimacy of non-presence and alterity with presence cuts into, at its root, the argument for the uselessness of the sign in the self-relation. 3. No doubt Husserl would refuse to assimilate the necessity of retention with the necessity of the sign, since the sign alone belongs, like the image, to the genus of representation and symbol. And Husserl cannot renounce this rigorous distinction without putting the axiomatic principium of phenomenology into question. The vigor with which he supports the idea that retention and protension belong to the sphere of originarity, provided that we understand it in a broad sense, the insistence with which he opposes the absolute validity of primary memory to the relative validity of secondary memory, these indeed manifest his intention and uneasiness. He is uneasy because what is at issue is to save together two apparently irreconcilable abilities. A. The living now is constituted as the absolute perceptual source only in continuity with retention as non-perception. The faithfulness to experience and to the things themselves forbids that the source be constituted in any other way. And B. Since the source of certainty in general is the originarity of the living now, it is necessary to maintain retention in the sphere of originary certainty and shift the border between originarity and non-originarity. That it passes not between the pure present and the non-present, between the actuality and the non-actuality of a living now, but between two forms of return, or of the resituation of the present, retention and representation. without reducing the abyss that can in fact separate retention from representation, without concealing that the problem of the relation is nothing more than the history of life and of life's becoming conscious, we must be able to say a priori that their common root, the possibility of repetition in its most general form, the trace in the most universal sense, is a possibility that not only must inhabit the pure actuality of the now, but also must constitute it by means of the very movement of the différance that the possibility inserts into the pure actuality of the now. Such a trace is, if we are able to hold on to this language without contradicting it and erasing it immediately, more originary than the phenomenological originarity itself. The ideality of the form of presence itself implies consequently that it can be repeated to infinity, that its return as the return of the same is to infinity necessary and inscribed in presence as such, that the return is the return of a present that will be retained in a finite movement of retention, that there is originary truth in the phenomenological sense, only insofar as it is enrooted in the finitude of this retention. Finally, that the relation to infinity can be instituted only in the openness to the ideality of the form of presence as the possibility of a return to infinity. Without this non-identity to oneself of so-called originary presence, how are we to explain that the possibility of reflection and of representation belongs to the essence of every lived experience? How are we to explain that reflection belongs as an ideal and pure freedom to the essence of consciousness? Husserl constantly emphasizes this for reflection in Ideas 1, and representation already in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. In all of these directions, the presence of the present is thought beginning from the fold of the return, beginning from the movement of repetition and not the reverse. Does not the fact that this fold in presence or in self-presence is irreducible, this trace or this différance is always older than presence and obtains for it its openness, forbid us from speaking of a simple self-identity, im selben Augenblick? Does not this fact compromise the use Husserl wants to make of the solitary life of the soul, and consequently the rigorous distribution between indication and expression? Is it not the case that indication and all the concepts from which we have attempted to so far think it, existence, nature, mediation, empiricity, etc., have in the movement of transcendental temporalization an origin that cannot be uprooted? Likewise, it is not the case that all of what is announced in this reduction to the solitary life of the soul, and consequently the rigorous distribution between indication and expression? Is it not the case that indication and all the concepts from which we have attempted to so far link it, existence, nature, mediation, empiricity, etc., have in the movement of a transcendental temporalization an origin that cannot be uprooted? Likewise, it is not the case that all of what is announced in this reduction to the solitary life of the soul, the transcendental reduction in all of its stages, and notably the reduction to the monadological sphere of the proper Eigenheit, etc., is not, as it were, fissured in its possibility by what is called time? It is fissured by what has been called time, and to which it would be necessary to give another title, since time has always designated a movement through beginning from the present, and since time can say nothing but the present. Must we not say that the concept of pure solitude and of the monad of phenomenological sense is split open by its own origin, by the very condition of its self-presence? Time, rethought beginning from the difference in auto-affection, beginning from the identity of identity and non-identity in the same of the im selben Augenblick? Husserl has himself evoked the analogy between the relation to the alter ego, such that it is constituted within the absolute monad of the ego, and the relation to the other, past, present such, that is constituted in the absolute actuality of the living present. Cartesian Meditations, section 52. Is it not the case that this dialectic, in all the senses of this word and prior to every speculative resumption of this concept, opens living to différance, constituting in the pure immanence of the lived experience the hiatus of indicative communication and even of signification in general? We are indeed saying the hiatus of indicative communication and of signification in general, for Husserl intends not only to exclude indication from the solitary life of the soul. He will consider language in general, the element of the logos in its expressive form itself, as a secondary event, added on to an originary and pre-expressive stratum of sense. Expressive language itself will have to supervene on the absolute silence of the self-relation.